This playlist collects together and organizes the segments of the lecture covering the material in the Dershowitz article on torture. We'll start off by talking a little bit about who Alan Dershowitz is. Then I'll outline Dershowitz's opinion and then present Dershowitz's argument for his particular position. And the central idea in this argument, which was presented in this paper in 2004 when the U.S. was actively engaging in what some people call torture light, was that given the current situation, given the fact that governments torture, there were really three possible courses of action that a government like the United States government could take in response to that seemingly prescient fact about the behavior of governments. Dershowitz wants to argue that two of those possible courses of action are untenable, and that leaves his third course of action, which is this suggestion that the United States create a system of torture warrants that would allow for a legal process whereby there'd be judicial review on a number of cases that would allow for those cases approved through judicial review to then move on and subjects in those cases be tortured. The two alternatives that he rejects is just outright banning the use of torture, and then the other option is to continue on having an official ban on torture, but practicing torture all the same. So he'll argue against those two positions in favor of his own, this warrant position. And a central piece of this argument will be his argument that there is no real way to effectively ban torture. And he'll really talk about two reasons why we might suppose that's the case. One reason that he discusses is just the historical lapses into torture by various governments at various times. But the second, and I think the central and more compelling thing that he talks about for him and in his own perception of the strength of the argument, is this hypothetical case called the ticking bomb case, which purports to provide us with a strong intuition that there are situations where it's morally appropriate, or at least morally neutral, to torture people. And so we'll want to look at that central notion in the rest of the lecture. I'll focus exclusively on that. When we look over at Scary, we'll look at the relationship between that and some of the claims he makes about warrants. So we'll characterize the underlying logic in the ticking bomb case. The ticking bomb case is really a case of utilitarian reasoning. And we'll want to look at that. And particularly, we want to look at the sorts of criticisms that we saw Rachel's bring up with respect to utilitarianism. Namely, are we ever in a position on utilitarian grounds to argue that the morally correct thing to do is to violate people's rights or act unjustly towards them and so on? Then I'm going to want to spend some time talking about the ticking bomb case, this hypothetical thought experiment, and the sorts of real torture practices that Dershowitz suggests that it somehow is relevant to evaluating. And we're going to want to look and see if there's really a strong case to be made, even if we were to find the ticking bomb case compelling. How does it relate to the sorts of practices that occurred during this period and that Dershowitz advocates for in his own view? And then finally, we want to look at whether or not when people think about the ticking bomb case, they really do a good job of being a utilitarian. are the utilitarian calculations. What is the good? What is the bad? What is the net happiness generated by this action in this case? And I'm going to give us reasons to think that people don't do a very good job of assessing the actual utility, particularly when we look at real world cases. So this is Alan Dershowitz. He's a lawyer and an academic working in criminal and constitutional law. He received his law degree from Yale Law School in 1962. He joined the faculty of Harvard Law School in 1962 and held the position of Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard University from 1993 until his retirement in 2013. He's the author of at least 10 books and many articles. He's worked on a number of high-profile legal cases during his career. He is part of the Patty Hearst team, the O.J. Simpson team, the Mike Tyson team. So he's a high-profile lawyer who's taught at a highly respected law school and who has been quite prolific as a researcher as well. So he gives us a sort of statement of his position on page 256 of his article, and he says the following. Non-lethal torture is currently being used by the United States to secure information deemed necessary to prevent acts of terrorism. It's being done below the radar scheme, without political accountability, and indeed with plausible deniability. All forms of torture are widespread among nations that have signed treaties prohibiting all torture. The current situation is unacceptable. It tolerates torture without accountability and encourages hypocritical posturing. So, Dershowitz is going to want to argue that, in fact, the U.S. and other countries should adopt a very specific policy that allows certain cases of torture through a judicial review process, through warrants.